I guess I probably should begin with a brief warning. I saw an old friend of mine in the corridor just before I was coming down here, and he asked me what I was going to be talking about. And my instant summary was, angry middle-aged man shouts at the wind about grammar teaching. So if that doesn't sound like what you've signed up for, it's not too late to leave, okay? So I guess we should probably get started. Thank you all very much for turning up to the dreaded post-lunch slot. My name's Hugh Dellar. I'm a coursebook writer and teacher and a teacher trainer based in North London. I run my own online language school and training company called Lexical Lab, and I've co-authored the 6-level outcomes series for National Geographic, among other things. And what I'm really going to be talking about is, as you can probably tell from the title, grammar. And sort of asking people just to reflect really on what the point of the continuing obsession that we have in language teaching with grammar actually is. And what is it we're doing all the grammar teaching for? And obviously, a lot of what teachers end up doing happens because of a lot of what course books give to teachers to end up doing. As a course book writer and a teacher, I'm very familiar with that kind of, not always entirely healthy relationship between course book content and classroom reality. And you only need to have a brief flick through any course book out there to see how completely saturated with grammar the kind of English language market still is, particularly in terms of the way it is presented through course books. I was looking through recently the new B2 level of a new global English language series that shall remain unnamed. And in this particular book, this is B2 students who are kind of post-first certificate, well on their way to Cambridge Advanced, they already speak pretty good English. Here's a sample of some of the grammar from this particular book. Okay? A sample. Okay? So, you've passed Cambridge First Certificate, you're well on your way to Advanced, you join a new course, and here's what you get. Question forms, past simple and continuous, again. Present perfect simple and continuous, again. Comparatives, superlatives for the 15th time. Quantifiers, forming adjectives, because presumably you don't know how to do that if you've already passed first certificate. Should have and shouldn't have, reported speech again, future forms again, second conditionals again, and so on. And as I said, this was actually just a small sample. There was more, but I couldn't condense it all down onto one particular PowerPoint slide. And when you've got classroom material that's still so completely saturated in these kinds of very, very dense unpacking of endless grammatical structures, right the way through the levels, and a lot of series now are going 6 levels, 7 levels, 8 levels, and you've got this massive grammar load being dropped into classrooms at every level. And when you've got this, obviously, you end up with teachers having to do grammar. And anyone who's been through any kind of teacher training course, you'll know there's those discussions you have about what kind of lesson are you going to be doing. I'm going to be doing a grammar lesson tomorrow. And even though obviously doing grammar can mean different things to different people in different contexts, I think what it often means, maybe what it all too often means, is that because of the way the grammar load is structured and because of the way it's presented to us via classroom material, what we end up doing when we're doing grammar is sort of unpacking or kind of unboxing, if you like, via PPP lessons where you sort of present, get students to practice, you do a bit of praying, and you hope that maybe they produce the particular grammatical structure that you're looking at in glorious isolation in this particular lesson. Basically, that's what a lot of teachers end up doing, and that's the way we end up thinking about what we're doing when we're doing grammar in the course book. And because of the, I guess, kind of privileged status that grammar still gets within the contents of course books, it then gets this kind of privileged status within state exams particularly. Many of you working outside of the UK, you won't need me to tell you how grammar-centric and grammar-dominated a lot of state exams still are. And it comes to dominate also, I think, the way teachers think about their jobs. It comes to dominate the way we think about what makes us competent as teachers, what's expected of us, what we should be doing in the classroom. And I think, given that we tended to kind of place grammar up on this high pedestal, where grammar is still worshipped above all other content in the language classroom, it's worth just stopping at this stage, maybe, and just thinking, well, okay, if we're doing all this grammar, and if we're constantly being asked to unpack and PPP all of this grammar, why? Well, what's it for? Well, what is the kind of grammar we're giving students for them to do with? Well, what is it we're expecting to then happen with all of these PPP-based lessons that we're giving students? And I'm going to give you just a minute or two. This may sound like a weird question, but I'm not sure if it's a question you've ever articulated to yourself before. What is all of that grammar that you're giving your students for? Okay, what's the point of it? Why are we doing all of this? Can I give you just a couple of minutes with the people next to you to see what you come up with? Good luck. I won't put anyone on the spot by eliciting answers from the audience, but when I've asked these kinds of questions before, either face-to-face or on social media or whatever, to try and get a kind of straw poll of what teachers think the purpose of doing grammar is, you get a range of answers, many of which are very grand-sounding and very idealistic. And it doesn't surprise me that teachers come out with these kind of grand idealistic statements, given the kind of predominance of grammar in English language teaching and in English language testing material. So you get statements like this: grammar helps you organise your thinking. It's like a maths formula, because language is just like algebra, apparently. Once you know it, you can use it in every appropriate situation. Helps you understand everything better. Everything, not just language apparently, but astrophysics, geopolitics. Without grammar, students won't be able to speak in or about certain situations. I do grammar so that my students can grammar. Nice playful kind of explanation. Provides learners with the means to generate a huge number of sentences. Pushes students, helps prevent fossilisation. Primes them to notice things which might make it stick. Helps students fine-tune their language. This kind of language as engine kind of metaphor. And I like this last quote. I think this is very revealing. If I don't talk about tenses, my students get anxious. When I read this, I sort of thought, well, maybe your students also get anxious because you keep talking about tenses. Maybe you've got the cause and effect the wrong way round. Maybe it's the fact that you keep emphasising tenses and structural grammar that is actually creating the grammar anxiety that you're interpreting as the reason for you having to keep doing what you're already doing. Just a thought. And my favourite quote was this one. Grammar's what allows teachers to pretend that teaching language is an academic endeavour. And I asked this particular person what they meant by this, and they said, well, without this, teaching's a bit like being a driving instructor. You're kind of teaching a life skill. You're just kind of equipping somebody with something that they can take out into the world and carry on using on the road of their life once you've gone. If you add grammar to it, it gives you a kind of authority in the classroom. And I think particularly in this day and age where you've got a younger generation growing up who are absorbing English all the time through the internet, and who are often coming to class knowing things that teachers don't know, okay? And this really isn't a kind of native, non-native issue. This is just, there are kids out there who know stuff that, other people don't know because you're older than them. And when kids are coming to class having picked things up from whatever Netflix series they're watching, it can be quite intimidating and it can be quite kind of challenging to you as a teacher. So I think what a lot of teachers have traditionally sort of tried to do is to reassert their authority by saying, you may know a whole load of slang that you've picked up from Netflix, but do you know what a reduced adverbial participle clause is? Because I do, so respect me. And I think it's a dangerous kind of way to get into thinking, but I understand how that comes about. That idea to cling on to grammar because it allows us to maintain a kind of veneer of academicity, or what's the word I'm looking for? Of being academic in that kind of context. So I think, given that grammar does still dominate the way that we often think about input in the language classroom, and as a result, it still impacts upon the kind of output that students are often required to produce in the classroom, as part of this kind of PPP paradigm, I think it's probably worth just stopping to think about whether there might be other ways to think about what the point of grammar teaching actually is, okay? And I'm going to kind of flip it around a little bit. I'm going to show you some examples of some board work that I've come up with over recent weeks and months. And I'm going to show it quite quickly, so my apologies if you have to absorb quite a lot in a short period of time. What I'd like you to think about is, when you're looking through the sentences that you're going to see, okay, the kind of board work or input that I'm providing students with in class, what kind of uniting features do you see in the examples or in the sentences? Okay? And I'll leave that kind of loose and open. But what kind of things do you think unites, or what do they all have in common, the kinds of examples that you're going to see? So there's 3 slides of examples. I'll give you just a few minutes to read through. Sorry. Take your time reading. This may also be reassuring for any of you who've ever worried about your handwriting and board work. Okay, next slide. No? Not okay, thank you. Okay. And the last one. You'll get the drift. Can I just give you a couple of minutes with the people next to you, just to think about what kind of commonalities there are between these examples? What kind of things do you think they have in common? Okay? And I'll leave that quite open and I'll talk through what I think they have in common in a minute and what this has to do with grammar teaching. Okay? Talk through what I think is happening here, okay, and how I think this connects to the input that we provide, and how I think it connects to maybe reframing or rethinking what the point of grammar teaching is. I think the first thing to say is what unites all of these examples is they're just normal, everyday, spoken language. It's basically the English that is generally spoken. And if general English means anything, for me, it must mean the English that people generally use, okay? I think we often kind of forget that when we think about teaching general English. All of the examples you saw there are whole sentences. Sometimes they're little mini dialogues, or you answer in short, condensed kinds of clauses. They're all very clearly kind of interactional. They're all kind of exist in particular contexts. And quite a lot of them are quite formulaic, they're quite predictable kinds of expressions, they're just sort of normal, typical ways that a fluent user might express a particular idea. And if you don't know how to express things in typical formulaic kind of ways, you actually end up doing a lot more work. I was teaching last week and one of my students said something and then she wanted to kind of unsay it. And she was trying to sort of apologise, and she ended up saying something like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't think before expressing that idea, and when I expressed that idea, the words I used weren't the words I wanted to use," and it went on and on and on. And at the end of it, I just said, yeah, it came out wrong. Okay? And if you don't know how to say, "Oh, sorry, that came out wrong," you have to kind of use the fallback plan, plan B, which is putting language together using grammar structures and single words. And it's a much longer, more complicated, more error-prone way of doing things than knowing the simple, condensed, predictable, formulaic way of saying things. Maybe more pertinently for this particular talk, almost all of the examples you saw there are grammatically pretty simple. Okay? I mean, the grammar that's going on there is basically present simple, present continuous, past simple, present perfect simple, going to, will, must have, would love to, can't, a few bits and pieces with modals. Very, very, very little of that grammar that you saw on that first page that's dropped onto B2 students comes up in these kinds of contexts. And the reason for that is all of these sentences, and for me, this is my answer to what I think grammar should be for. What is it we hope to achieve with the grammar we're teaching? All of the things you see on these kinds of examples are one of two things. They're either reworkings of things that students have tried to say, okay? So it's students expressing their own meanings and expressing their ideas, and me as a teacher saying, yeah, I know what you mean this, and giving them the English to say what they wanted to try and say. Or else, as in the example of break the news, okay? They're fully grammaticalized examples of how the vocabulary that's come up and vocabulary that students have been asking about are typically used. And what you notice when you're doing that, what you notice when you're basically helping students to use the new vocabulary that they've encountered and helping them to say whatever they want to say about a wide range of different topics is, what you notice is you really do not need most of this, okay? Most of what you need to do those things, as you've seen, is grammatically quite simple. It's basically stuff that most students have already learned at pre-int. Present simple, continuous, past simple, etc. You know, most of that's covered already at elementary. At the same time, I'm guessing, no one looked at those sentences and thought, these are just elementary sentences of English. You obviously don't read them and interpret them like that, because what makes them advanced, B2, C1 level, whatever, you know, the kind of examples of things fluent users might say, isn't the fact that they're using unusual, complicated, rarely seen grammatical structures. What makes them high level is the fact that they're lexically sophisticated and that they show a grasp of, you know, predictable, formulaic kind of usage. They're examples of probable language rather than what's simply grammatically possible. So, I think all of this has quite serious ramifications for the way we think about the classroom. And the first thing, just to clarify, you know, before anyone starts to panic and think, must have grammar in class. I'm not saying don't teach grammar. What I am saying is, once you've taught it once, you've taught it. Okay? Stop teaching it again and again and again and again and again. And if there are any publishers in the audience, stop forcing course books to do this and forcing course book writers to do this. Because, you know, the idea that at B2 you're still looking at the past simple and past continuous, and you're still doing the lesson on conditionals, and you're still doing the lesson on the present perfect, enough already. That doesn't mean don't deal with it if it comes up, okay? If it comes up and students have problems with it, deal with it in the moment that it comes up. And I think what it means is prioritising spoken language, prioritising conversation, prioritising also grammar for speech. And I think a lot of the time, a lot of the grammar that we end up looking at, particularly kind of post-pre-intermediate, is much more commonly grammar for writing than grammar for speech. You know, those of you who've slogged through those painful lessons trying to work out if something is a defining or a non-defining relative clause. You know, when you're speaking, it doesn't matter. There is no comma in speech. That stuff only really becomes relevant when you're actually having to write. And if you've got students who are having to write for particular purposes, that's fine. It's probably worth spending time on. But I think maybe as teachers we would be better off thinking about what grammar do my students need to speak fluently, and then thinking about, do my students need to write? What kind of things do they need to write? What kind of grammar do they need to write fluently in those kinds of contexts? And if you're doing what I'm suggesting, which is helping students say what they want to try and say in a wide range of situations, what you're doing all the time is you're showing them this subtle interaction between grammar and vocabulary. You're kind of helping them to language in real time. And a lot of the time, with these things that you've seen earlier, they're basically going over things that students have seen already. My student who didn't know how to say, sorry, that came out wrong, that's not because she had any problems with the past simple. Okay? It's because she just didn't know that expression. And fine, if you're going to deal with fossilised errors, when students make the fossilised errors, feel free to point it out, feel free to correct it. I think what happens is, because of the kind of dominance of PPP, we end up dumping on students these kinds of activities which are basically designed to force error. Okay? So when you've got the kind of free production stage of the passive or defining or non-defining relative clauses, the reason those exercises are written is to catch students out and to give the teacher something to correct in the belief that that will stop them making those mistakes again, which we all know it won't. Okay? And I think just kind of, it's much more sensible to allow a broader, freer range of talking within the classroom and to deal with problems as and when they come up in kind of grammatical terms. I think it's also just recognising that in spoken language, in spoken English, there are many other patterns which are really, really useful for students, which don't fall under the traditional bracket of grammar. When you ask teachers, you know, what actually is grammar, most of the way we're conditioned to think about grammar is what's appeared in course books with the heading grammar on it, What's in Raymond Murphy's English grammar in use? Okay? And teachers will usually say the tense system, modals, passives, conditionals, etc. Well, there are all these little kind of bits that are sort of halfway between grammar and vocabulary. So you've got things like, you're a bit too nice for your own good, you. You're a bit too generous for your own good sometimes. You're too kind for your own good. People will take advantage of you. It wasn't as good as I thought it would be. As a kind of fixed chunk with the grammar embedded within it. You've got these things that are often used with the present perfect. It's been difficult over the last few years. Over the next few weeks, things should become clearer. And again, because of the testing system, because of the way in which we tend to do what we've always been given to do before, when most people think about the present perfect, the thing we're conditioned to worry about is for or since. Okay? A hell of a lot of the time, you don't use for at all. I've worked here 10 years. I've lived here 25 years. And when you do use prepositions, one common preposition is the over, over recent weeks, over the last few months, over recent years. Again, not taught because it's not presented in the kind of PPP model, but it's very, very common in spoken language. And then you've got things like, they're not supposed to, whatever it is they're not supposed to, but they do. They're not supposed to smoke in here, but they sometimes do in the back room. Not anyone out there, by the way, but just in case they see me waving my arm in their direction. But those kinds of examples, those patterns are really common. And as teachers, the more we focus on spoken language, the more aware we become of these kinds of patterns. And that's developmental for us, and it's developmental for our students and their ability to kind of use grammar in action when putting vocabulary to use and when expressing meanings you want to express. As I said, if students make mistakes, deal with them when they happen. I think a lot of grammar teaching is kind of predicated on a fear of possible future mistakes which haven't happened yet. And what then happens is you create material that increases the likelihood of those mistakes being made, and then you punish the students for having made the mistakes that you forced them into making in the first place. If you're just talking to someone and interacting with them, well, if something becomes a problem, fine, tackle it. Otherwise, don't make it an issue until it's an issue. And I think finally, just something for all teachers to really think about is if what you're doing is focusing more on spoken language and you're working more from student output, try to think about ways of teaching grammar as part of whole phrases, or teaching grammar as lexis. In the way that when you buy a phrase book, you learn whole sentences or whole phrases. When you first start speaking a language, you learn, what do you do, what's your name? You don't learn, this is an example of a WH question, followed by a form of the verb to be, followed by a possessive adjective, followed by a singular form of a countable noun. This is how to kill a beginner level class. You learn those as whole expressions with the grammar embedded because the meaning's obvious. This is from an elementary class I was teaching recently. And we basically just did this little role play of students talking about what are you doing this weekend, and then kind of inviting people and kind of just sharing their arrangements and inviting. And we ended up with all this kind of input, like what time do you finish work, what time's the film start, what time do you start work in the morning, what time's the play end, what time do you get into Paris. And that's grammar, that's the present simple for future timetables or whatever. But it's basically presented as phrases which can be memorised, learned and reused. Okay, well, I'll meet you around 5, I'll see you on Sunday, I'll give you a bell later on, I'll call you later on. Again, it's will for decisions made at the time of speaking. But these kinds of things come up all the time. They're not just one lesson in one unit in the course book where you dump the PPP unboxing of the grammar on the students. They're things which get recycled and repeated and revisited all the time because when we speak normally, we're not forced just to use one particular structure. We use language interactively, we use all the structures interactively. And I think just thinking a bit more about, okay, yes, they do need this grammar. What is it they need to be able to do with this grammar in this lesson, in this conversation, at this particular kind of level? So I think thinking a bit more about teaching grammar as part of whole phrases and showing patterns and showing how grammar and vocab interact is again a real power that teachers can bring to the classroom and something that we can add that maybe the course books don't necessarily always provide for. I'm bang on half an hour, which has flown by. So I'm just going to finish by saying, if anyone wants copies of the slides or anything, please email me. It's Hugh@Lexical Lab. If anyone's got any questions, come find me. I'll be around. Or email me. Check out the website, and if you're on Instagram, follow us. Thank you very much for your time and attention.